Here's the second part, forgetting. Forgetting is super interesting to me. Here's a quote I came up with. I know I taught this last year. I know last year's teacher taught it. Why can't they remember it? Okay. The thing that I've been learning that Sat and I talk about is learning is a natural thing. And we're going to go back to this guy here, whose name is Hermann Ebbinghaus. Back about 150 years ago, he started, no, not even, yeah, 150 years ago, he started studying memory, and he came up with this thing called the forgetting curve. It's been replicated lots and lots of times over the last century. And basically, it's the idea that new information, new things that enter our brain disappear at a pretty predictable rate. Now, I'm a little skeptical of the numbers because there's other influences that play into this. Things like our motivation, our emotional connection to the learning. All of those sorts of things definitely aren't represented here. But the important thing that this tells us is that there is a very significant drop in learning right away when we encounter new things, and it's fairly predictable. Okay, it's called the forgetting curve. And it's going to be super important for us when we think about how to help kids, because the brain naturally forgets. Cognitive scientists here from McGill, forgetting something isn't like a glitch in the brain. It's the fact that it's part of the natural processing, natural functioning of the brain. If your brain didn't forget, it wouldn't be functioning properly. And I was trying to figure out why that is, and I couldn't find any real consensus. There's a couple of interesting theories. One is that not everything is worth remembering. There is a condition where people remember almost everything that's happened to them, and it's not a pleasant experience. And so even from a trauma perspective, being able to forget things is a gift. Forgetting the brain itself doesn't know importance, but by forgetting and then recalling and then strengthening, we can give importance to things that we want. The other thing I think that's quite interesting, and it goes back to that episodic and semantic, is that forgetting and then retrieving or recalling, what we're going to talk about next week, actually starts to decontextualize learning and makes it more applicable. Because the more semantic it is, the less connected it is to a specific context, the more generalizable it is, and then we can apply learning to new contexts, right? Like a word, if you could only ever use a word in the time and place that you learned it, that word's not useful. But by relearning something in multiple places and multiple times, we have to forget it to relearn it to make it useful. So that's kind of something to keep in mind that when we're thinking about with kids, that them forgetting is not a problem. It's just part of the way the human brain works, okay? And it's the other thing it's useful for me to think is that the dominant metaphor of the brain over the last, 30 years, 40 years has been the brain is like a computer. It has memory, it has storage, it has connections, it has networks, it has wiring, it has encoding, it has electrical signals. So it's a very convenient metaphor. But there's some really key ways why the brain is not like a computer. One of them, super important, it's going to be a theme that we're going to come back to, is in a computer, your processing ability is totally separate from the file structure, right? When you get a new computer, it's all the processing is there. And you can put files on, you can put files off, and you can change the processor, and it doesn't change the files. They're totally separate, right? And the processor works on the files. And we often, I think about this with the brain, where we think, oh, critical thinking, for example, just works on content, right? That we develop critical thinking on some files over here. But that's not, from a cognitive science perspective, they're far more integrated. In our brains, the processor and the file structure are together. There is no separation. Everything we store changes the way we process. So our critical thinking gets better because we have these huge, rich bodies of knowledge. that influences our critical thinking. It's not like we have a split between I can critically think about something. It's that the stuff that I have helps me get better at critical thinking. And when we think about forgetting, some really interesting things here, the mind does not passively or literally record things that you see. It's always, back to what we shared earlier, it's always processing it through what's in there before, through our cognitive biases. It's always searching for meaning. And so we don't create literal snapshots. Different people who experience the same event experience it differently because of what they bring to it. And this is going to be super important as we come next week. Every time we forget something and we recall it, it changes. It gets reconstructed. So on a file system, on my laptop, every time I pull up a Word file that I'm working on, it doesn't change unless I change it. But I could pull out the same Word file a whole bunch of times for the rest of the computer's life. And every time I pull it up, it would be identical. Memory is not like that. Every time you bring a memory forward, it changes. And there's some fascinating research that's been done that our memories are quite unreliable. There's a Netflix show I'm going to tell you about at the end, where they followed a bunch of adolescents, interviewed a whole bunch of adolescents at age 15 about their lives, and then interviewed them at age 40 about those same events. Half of the events were wrong. 50% of childhood memories in this study were incorrect, because we recall them, we layer on things, we layer in movies, we layer in stories, and our brains actually change the memories that are in there. And we can have false memories. There's psychological experiments that have been replicated a number of times where psychologists have convinced people that they've committed crimes that they haven't committed, that they've gone to places that they've never gone, by planting memories in people. So our brains aren't like these perfect, we don't store learning memories really perfectly. Okay, that's going to be super important when we come to a couple of things in a couple of weeks. So thank you for sticking around. Back to this. Take a minute now and think about all the stuff we just talked about, all that theory. What does it say to this statement? We live in the 21st century, surrounded by devices that look up any piece of information in the blink of an eye. Why would you commit anything to memory when you can Google it? Take a second. If you got a couple people in the room, you can talk about it. If you're on your own, you can just kind of think through that. And then we will wrap up in a couple minutes. So this was what I wrote when I thought about that question. The brain is literally reshaped by what it consolidates, what it connects. Our brains think, read, speak, problem solve, even perceive differently based on what we come to internalize and deeply understand. So I think it's a dangerous idea. I think this idea that we can just allow things to be Googled, because the way we literally interact with the world from a cognitive science perspective is all through this filter of everything we've experienced and internalized. And we're going to, again, these are some big ideas, and we're going to come back to them in different ways over the following weeks and make use of them in the classroom. So let me just, I'm going to go forward a little bit here. The slides are available for this. A couple of things you may find interesting between now and next week. A couple of just, strictly for your own interest. There's two, if you have Netflix, there's a really interesting Netflix 20-minute video called The Mind Explained. Memory, or if you type in Memory Explained, it pops up. It's 20 minutes. It's very well done, very watchable. And it goes to a lot of kind of what we just talked about and some of the really interesting stuff about more stories about the brain. And then there's another TED Talk there about and I've linked to that one if you get the slides. How reliable is our memory? And some of the more things about the changing nature of our brain. Some documents if you want to look at. We've created each one of these workshops, we're going to create a summary document. And so this one's called The Practice Guide of Memory and Forgetting. There's a great blog post by an author who I really, really like, which kind of goes through the Willingham model and why it's important to have a theory of learning, what some of the implications are. So that there's a link there if you want it. And then another summary of a whole bunch of research by a group in the States called Deans of Impact. I really like this one. Satnam and I know we've talked about it because it has a huge list of people who have signed off on it. Of sort of writers, John Hattie, Dylan Williams, Carol Dweck. There's all these like people who agree with everything that's in there. And so it's a really solid foundational document. Okay, so next week we promise we'll finish on time. Thank you for sticking with us. And I'll just go back to these slides here. And just, if you want, these can be some reflection for you. The slides, the recording, and those links, there's a new little button that we've put on the website for this series, deltalearns.ca/powerful practices. And so as soon as it's done, I'll put the video on there and the slides and everything, and you can access anything you need there. All right. We will stop there. We appreciate your patience sticking with us over time.